Hi there, I'm Sarah Tepema. I'm a member and I'm a volunteer for the Society of Actuaries. I'm also on the board and I'm the chair of D&I activity for the SOA. I'm co-chair of the SOA and CAS Committee on Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity. So anyway, as part of all of that, we're recording a video today for the SOA Thanks Volunteer video series. And today I'm super excited and very honored to have Ron Gebhardtsbauer join me for a conversation about LGBTQ inclusion in our profession and in society. So Ron, hi. Thanks for spending some time with us today and to talk about your experiences. I would love to hear more about your background.
Hi, Sarah. Yeah. I'm an actuary. I'm an FSA. I started out I was born in the 50s, and it was a pretty bad time for being gay. And so probably young people today wouldn't even believe it was so bad back then. But even us older adults, the world has changed so much right now that I think, when I went over some of the stuff that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I almost couldn't believe it myself. So it was the love that dare not speak its name, being gay. In fact, the word gay was not even allowed to be printed in the newspapers. They had rules on what words they could use and not use. You weren't allowed to use the word gay or lesbian. So we didn't ever read about it. You didn't hear about it. Today, you hear LGBT, gay, lesbian, transgender. So all kinds of words are used now. Everybody reads about it all the time. But back then, you never heard about it. And so I didn't know anything about it. I was very naive. And when I started thinking maybe I'm different, I noticed when I was 12 or 13 that all the guys started talking about girls. And why are they talking about girls? And I didn't understand it. They'd take them out on dates and pay for them. And for me, I was like, why are they? I did it. I wanted to be just like everybody else. There's a syndrome that gay men back then had. There's a book about it called The Best Little Boy. Because we were different than everybody else. We were nervous about it. We locked that thought way back in the back of our heads that we were maybe gay, locked it up in our subconscious and didn't deal with it. And so when I noticed other guys were doing things with girls and having fun, enjoying, relationships, I was scared. Maybe, what was I? Was I asexual? And finally I started thinking, well, maybe I was math sexual because I loved math.
I love math sexual. That's awesome. I think I am too, actually.
Yeah, I really loved it. And it wasn't until after college that I realized that maybe, I was a real human being with emotions and feelings and things like that. And you can understand why, to talk about the world back then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you were a criminal according to the law. Mm-hmm. There was a court case in the 80s where it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yep, gay people are illegal and they're not protected by the Constitution. And it wasn't until 2003 that a court case finally went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said, our decision back in the 1980s was terrible, and it's included in the Constitution through privacy. And the preamble to the Constitution says, we deserve our privacy. Under privacy, they say we deserve. I can't remember the words. I'm totally blanking.
Equal protection or something like that.
Well, equal protection under the law is in the amendments. The pursuit of happiness. That's what I'm thinking.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so if you can't have that in the private, the Supreme Court said that's not fair. So in addition to the law, where we were criminals back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, in addition, under the church, we were sinners. So I knew people, good friends of mine, who were kicked out of the church. They were ministers and they were kicked out of the church. And I have a neighbor who actually, up until just 5 years ago, when she realized she was a lesbian, the church kicked her out, and they wouldn't ordain her. And their parents were very involved in the church, and they were just kicked out and shunned. And then piling on, the medical profession said we were sick. So here are these three major professions in the world had concerns, and the medical profession actually went first in starting to change that. Back in the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association said, I think in 1974, that we're not sick. But in that debate, there were a lot of psychiatrists that said, no, all my gay patients are really sick. They really need our help. And other psychiatrists said, yeah, but have you talked to some gay people or lesbians that are not in counseling. And they said, oh, you know what? They're pretty healthy. So the APA went first.
Gee.
Right. The APA went first. And then I mentioned the law, and the church is still struggling. Some churches are good. Some churches are not so good. Some churches, like the one I was in, the United Methodist Church, is sort of splitting over this issue. The Western jurisdiction of the Methodist Church has gay and lesbian bishops, gay male men and lesbian bishops, and they do marriages, and they totally ignore the rules of the Methodist Church. So
yeah, I was raised Methodist, and my mom's still Methodist, and I've been following that very interesting political battles just, within a single church, and just expand that to the cultural wars that are going on now.
Yep. Yeah, they're still having problems. And so my brother is actually in a literalist fundamentalist church, Methodist church, that he thinks they're probably going to go the other way and they're going to split away from the church. And so he says at that point, he'll probably leave them because he loves me, luckily, and would not agree with him. But he thinks eventually they're on the wrong side of history and they will come back. So that's good. So that's a little bit of background on the history. The world was very different back then compared to what it is now. Oh, another thing, I needed to learn about what did it mean that I was gay. In my young 20s, I was really depressed that I would maybe never fall in love. I'd be lonely the rest of my life. I thought about suicide. I didn't want to be lonely. I really wanted to be someone that everybody loved, and that would be tough. And so I went out and read all kinds of history of gay men and lesbians, and it was hard to do that. Nowadays, you just go on the internet. Young kids have no problem with that, but you had to go into a bookstore, and you were afraid to go in a bookstore, or you went to a library and you were afraid that anybody would see you pulled out a book on something on gay history. But there were books way back in '79 when I came out that talked about being gay, and it said, you know what, some of these great people like Alexander the Great had a gay relationship with Hephaestion, and Roman Emperor Hadrian actually, his love was Antinous, and when Antinous died, he was so important they raised him to godlike levels and named cities after him and put him on coins, and there are more statues of Antinous than practically anybody. So, you go back to the 2,000 years ago, and the world wasn't so bad. Everybody thinks that Christian church has always been bad, but there were books that I read that said, the Christian church was not that negative about being gay or lesbian, and Jesus never talked about it. And if anything, he talks about people who are eunuchs by birth. So he maybe talked about it, and they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven. So I read through the whole Bible, and I felt like God didn't dislike me or hate me, and that helped me come out finally. Cool.
Well, and I'll go back a couple of years when the SOA, the Actuary magazine, published an interview with you, which I was so thrilled when I saw it. It made me so joyful to hear your words or to read your words. And it was just, I felt really good when I read it. I thought, this is great. I'm so excited that our society is publishing this, and, we're hearing stories like yours. And so that really made my heart sing. But, I was really impressed by how much of an activist you were. So I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that, and also, I guess, as activism has become a little more prominent in the last couple months, talk about how you see that intersecting with your professional life, or not intersecting with your professional life, and have you had any professional times where it feels like it's not in congruence with your activism?
Yeah, so Black Lives Really Matter. It's really giving a good word to activists again. And so I think my activism actually comes out through the church. The progressive wing of church normally Jesus actually disturbed the religious leaders and the political leaders of the day. He wasn't just private about religion or anything. And so a lot of the progressive religious people feel that our job is to help further God's kingdom, what Jesus would have wanted. So I hope I'm not getting too religious, but I wanted to make a better world. And so back in 1979, within 6 months, I came out with a bang, and I was really proud after reading the Bible and thinking that God didn't hate me, and finding out these great people were gay men and lesbians. So I helped organize the 1979 March on Washington, D.C.
Awesome.
And so we got over 100,000 people, and I was in charge of mass housing because I knew all these Methodist ministers who gave us all their church basements, just the progressive ones. The other stuff that I helped start a gay Methodist group. And just recently, in this past decade, now that the world's moved much further along, my husband and I were married in Maryland, where my mom and brother and sister live. But when I was back in Pennsylvania, our marriage was not recognized. And so we actually worked with the ACLU to sue the state for marriage equality, and we won. The governor decided not to appeal to the Supreme Court because he was afraid he'd lose. And so all of a sudden we were recognized. So my church had a sort of a wedding celebration for us.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that was really great. So we were definitely out at that point because all the news, ABC and CBS came here to film it, and we were at the front page of the newspaper here at Penn State.
Wow, cool.
So yeah, I'm definitely out now. You know, it's very different than the world in the 60s and 70s when I was afraid of myself and what I might be.
Oh, that's great. Well, so talk a little bit about coming out. You know, it's one thing to come out. Well, I guess you came out with a bang in some ways, but you know, how did you come out professionally, and how did that work for you, and what happened at that time?
Very good question, because even though I was like organizing the 1979 March on Washington, totally out on my private side, I was totally closeted at work, never told anybody. I might have eventually had a few friends that I told, but I was so afraid that if I came out, maybe I'd be fired. Or maybe I felt pretty good about the company where I was, but maybe I would have a difficult time in the future getting a job. And so back in the 70s, gay men, lesbians were very deathly afraid of being out professionally. So it did take a while for me to deal with that. And so the first thing I did was, not everybody who's viewing this will know what the transactions are, but the Society of Actuaries published these big fat documents that had all our research and our meetings information. And there was a big article on AIDS. Yeah. So in the 1980s were a very difficult time for gay men. And AIDS was also a big issue for the insurance industry, and legitimately so. Insurance companies don't want to go bankrupt. So there were questions about whether, redlining was happening. Some people were accusing insurance companies of that. And there was a big study on AIDS by some actuaries, and it was really good work. And I wrote a letter responding to it saying, hey, here's a couple other thoughts that you might have. And one was, you shouldn't redline because that captures all gays, and not all gay men are having intimate sex, or if they are, they're being safe. And it's interesting. Fauci, the doctor now who does so much on COVID, he actually became famous back in the 80s for AIDS. He helped develop some of the cures. And he said there are so many similarities between AIDS and COVID that we had to, gay men had to be protect ourselves. And in fact, at Penn State now, COVID is, how to protect yourself with social distancing and masks is part of Penn State's rules for when students come back in the fall. And I also wrote something for the fraternity where I'm an advisor and said, we should not stigmatize people who we find out have COVID. So all these things are the same. But anyway, back with this AIDS paper, I wrote a letter saying you should get to know some gay people. You'll find out we are not that different. We're just like everybody else. And one of the problems or one of the concerns that people said is we can hide. And so we'd have to be at the office cooler talking with other guys and never making jokes about gay people, or they might use the F word, faggot. And I'd have to smile and kind of laugh along with it. But it was a tough time. People were dying. I thought I had AIDS too. And luckily when the test didn't come out for like 5 years, But when the test came out, I was at Johns Hopkins, and they tested me, and they promised they wouldn't tell me the results because the protocol was to not let people know if they had AIDS. So they didn't tell me. But the next visit, they slipped and told me I didn't have AIDS. And so my health, my mental health, my whole body's health just got so much better. But anyway, back to the transactions article. I wrote that article and said we, so it was sort of my way of coming out and saying that, not all gay men are going to get AIDS if they're having protected sex or if they're being safe. And so that, and then also I wrote a letter to the editor to my Penn State alumni newsletter. They were talking about firing a gay professor. And so I said, if you get to know us, we're really good people. You will find us, we're just like you are. And who knew my boss was a Penn Stater.
Oh, no.
So he read it and he came by my office and said, I liked your article. And he never said anything more. I promise not to fire you. But I was a little nervous. By that time, I was the chief actuary of the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, a government agency. And luckily, the government was a progressive employer. And that's why I was becoming brave enough in the late 80s to be open. Sorry I'm taking so long on some of these questions.
No, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. And so I guess that you're talking about your workplaces. How would you say the profession was, how welcoming was the profession, or not welcoming? Was the actual profession at that time?
Yeah, good question. So I'd say back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was no different than everybody else. Okay. You couldn't get married, so there were no benefits. The laws said you could be fired until a recent Supreme Court decision last month, or this month, said now we can't be fired if you're employer of over 15 people. And so I was pretty nervous about being out back then. But by the 1990s, I felt much better. In fact, I was hired by the American Academy of Actuaries, and everybody there knew I was gay, and they still hired me. And I was hired to be the spokesperson for the profession, which is kind of amazing. I wasn't really out at the time. They knew I was gay, but that was okay. And then when I was hired by Penn State, also, I told my future boss that, he asked me if they really wanted me to come. And I said, well, I have to check with my spouse to see if he's willing to move here. And he had no problem with it. Even though he was a Republican, he was totally cool. And yeah.
There are gay Republicans too.
Exactly.
I will say that.
Exactly. Right.
I know a few. Yeah.
I slipped there and said something. I made a mistake. So you guys can cut that out. Cut that one. So yeah, now it's okay to be out. And I would say that the actuarial profession is actually very good on this issue. And I think part of it comes from our history. Mutual benefit societies back in England in the 1600s were formed in all these towns, and it was all about helping everybody in town. If a ship didn't come back, there would be a lot of widows and orphans in town, and so everybody banded together to help each other. And that's the background in which insurance companies came out of that, and kind of like the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. So I think this wonderful desire to help the group is a part of our DNA. And also my students
I love that.
And also my students would tell me that they feel comfortable going into the actual profession, and they've got jobs there now and they feel welcome. Insurance companies have domestic partner benefits and now benefits for gay people, and they have LGBTQ affinity groups where people can get together with allies to talk about how can our company be better on these issues. So I think it's a good industry, a good profession. My students say I think they feel that education is correlated highly with acceptance and being welcoming. So I think we're in the right place.
That's cool. Well, and back to that Supreme Court decision, which it's kind of hard for me to believe that it's now 2020 and you finally can't be fired for being gay. I mean, that to me is sort of mind-boggling, but I agree that I think the actuarial profession is probably been further ahead, much further ahead than maybe some other industries or different areas. And you talked a little bit about your students and how they feel accepted, and I guess how would you say that students are changing our culture, and like how would you say that your students are reacting, and maybe different? You grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Totally different story than now. Like, talk a little about that and your students and what you see.
Yeah, I'm always amazed when I talk to my students, and I don't come out in the classroom. I sometimes maybe talk about joint annuities, and I'll talk about two spouses. So that's like the furthest out I come in class. But then I will talk to some of the seniors, like the president of the Actual Science Club, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, Ron, everybody knows you're gay, and everybody knows your partner's name is Greg." And so I'll talk to them a little more and find out that they're in a totally different world, that even if they're religious or conservative, as you were pointing out, they're cool on acceptance and welcoming. And it just makes my heart feel good, because, the gay person, the gay little kid from back in the 60s who wanted everybody to love him and tried to be the best little boy in the world, now has been worrying for decades that, please love me kind of thing. Now I'm being accepted. And so it's a very different world. Yeah. That's
really interesting. So I have one of my daughters is a lesbian, and she jokes about how early she knew that, but and we've been very accepting of it, I would say. And she jokes, and she says, she goes, "I feel like I was denied an important part of my gay youth because you were too accepting of me." She didn't have all those obstacles, and she had plenty of obstacles, don't get me wrong, but I sort of feel okay about, like, she's mad at me for that. Okay, she's got to find something, but I
think that's wonderful, because my dad was quite progressive. He was wanting to be a priest in the Episcopal Church, and the bishop said, no, you're too progressive. But he was very welcoming. In fact, the progressive part of the church was very accepting, and the conservative side of the church was very not. And so my mom was from the conservative side, and it was not easy for 10 years. She didn't accept me for 10 years after I came out to her. It wasn't until the 1992 that she totally flipped. In fact, she went to my left eventually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, and I think, like, the other thing I'm seeing with the younger my daughter's generation, she's 21, my kids are all in their early 20s, is that, first of all, there's a lot more fluidity in terms of sexual orientation, and then also in terms of gender identity. Like the same daughter was sort of testing out non-binary identity for a while, and so she's now a she pronoun, but she was using they them pronouns, so that took some getting used to, and I had to beg for patience constantly, but we got there. And then, of course, then she went back to being she, which is also part of the fluidity and perfectly fine. So I guess, talk a little bit about, are you seeing that too with your student population as you work with folks?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing up the word non-binary. See, you're ahead of me because you have kids who are teaching you. And I had that experience recently where local church, because I was gay, they said, "Hey, can you come over and talk to our high school youth about GLBT issues?" And I said, "Well, I'm gay. I'm not a lesbian, or I'm not bi, or I'm not trans." So I called up the local LGBT center at Penn State and asked, maybe a transgender person could join me. And so the person that they suggested, I found out right there at the event, was non-binary. And like, what's that? And so it was really good for me to hear her story and understand, have empathy for her. And it was easy to have empathy once you heard it. It's like, wow, all of a sudden I understand. And so it helped me understand a whole bunch of other things. These kids are teaching, the high school kids were teaching, they already knew what these words were, and they were teaching me that, bisexual doesn't maybe make as much sense now because there's more than two genders, or pansexual now is more appropriate. And so it was a big eye opener for me. So like you said, they're much more fluid.
Yeah, great. That's right. Well, so I guess let's stay with the story of student population. And I guess, maybe you don't have any advice, but I guess I would like to ask you if you have any advice for candidates or students and members who are navigating the workplace or just coming up into the profession? Like, what would you tell them, or what do you tell them? Because I'm sure you give them lots of advice.
Yeah. So if a gay male student or a lesbian student or transgender student came to me, I would tell them that I think our profession is very welcoming. And some of my students have pointed out, you're graded on whether you pass exams. If you pass an exam, you go up higher. You don't have to always please the boss. So it's sort of more objective, not subjective. But I also mentioned what I mentioned earlier, that, we're an educated and we're sort of mathematical and logical people. And so I don't think is judgmental, more accepting, I think. So I think they're entering a good profession. And in fact, my students have told me who've graduated, got a job, that, yeah, their places are accepting. And I was going to tell you another story about my students. We have Penn State has the largest actual program in the country, at least it did for many years. And we had this huge actuarial science club. And every year they vote for a president. Well, one year they voted a non-American. He was from China to be the president. I was just so proud of my students for voting this Chinese student to be the president. And then it wasn't for a few months later I found out, oh, he's gay. And the students knew it. And they wanted him to be the president. And that being gay was a non-issue. That was fine with them. So, yeah, the world is much different. Oh, one more thing I was going to mention is the actuarial profession in the insurance industry, pension consulting, accounting firms rank very high on the LGBT employment list. So they rank companies with how accepting are they? Are they even accepting of transgender people, and on the health plans and things, which can get expensive, and they are, and so they're very highly ranked on these issues. So that also shows that we're in a good industry.
Yeah,
it's amazing how fast the world has changed. Once gay, lesbian, bisexuals were accepted, transgenders have been accepted much faster. My church, for example, was able to accept a non-discrimination statement back in the 90s for GLB, but they didn't want to add the T. They were too nervous about adding the T. And then just 5 years ago, we added the T with almost no debate. It was just like obvious. It's the same principle. Love one another. It's just what Jesus said. Love one another. Right. Love God. Love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. That's great. That's true. And I also love what you said as a profession, sort of a mutual benefit society philosophy. And I think that our joint committee for diversity and inclusion, it's a joint committee with the CAS, the SOA and the CAS. And we wrote a vision statement last year. And the first sort of premise of the vision statement is we want to be the STEM career of choice for diverse students. There's a different way we describe diverse students, but we so debated over, are we a STEM career of choice, or are we the STEM career of choice? And we decided, no, we want to be the STEM career of choice for diverse candidates. So I love that bringing in that whole one for all for one thing. That's great. So I have one more question, which is, sorry, go ahead.
Well, in fact, at Penn State, where I teach, I head up the actuarial program, math majors were welcome to join into the actuarial concentration. And over half the math majors joined the actuarial concentration because it was the best place to get a job if you were a math major. Yeah. So maybe we are the choice for STEM students.
We are the STEM career of choice. We are. So anyway, well, okay, so I guess back to advice. What advice would you have for me as an ally, an LGBTQ ally, and or as a manager of LGBTQ students and people?
Well, first off, I'd say, Sarah, you are already great. You're already there. So you're educated and accepting, and I can see you're doing great things. And so when you let people know that, LGBT employees will be happy to know, just say it out loud what you're doing and you're accepting. Let them know. Become their friends and allies. Start an LGBT affinity group at your company. So use more than just the boilerplate language from the EEOC, Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission. Mm-hmm. They say, little tiny letters, we're accepting of all these different groups. Make more of a splash on it, saying, we really believe this. We really are welcoming. I think, as I said, the actuarial community and the insurance world, I think, is pretty good on this, as shown in the surveys.
Cool. Well, great. I guess any other final closing thoughts?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned in my article, I'll just mention here, and that was I'm really proud of my students. And it's really interesting talking to the alums, and they come back and they show me really good things about our profession. So, for example, on Wall Street, caveat emptor is sort of the rules. But in our profession, we have a code of conduct, to have integrity and uphold the profession and be confidential, but be honest and all these things. And so my students who are involved in merger and acquisition work, even though they're on different companies in opposing parties, they really are behind this rule of giving full and good information to each other. They don't hide it. And it was just really neat to hear things like that. So I really do think we have great quality people. And so it's really great for me to be able to tell my future students, based on what my alums tell me, that they're really entering a great profession. And I feel that way. I was a very lucky person after, now that I'm retired from being a professor, heading up the actual science program and out there skiing in the Rockies all the time. And I look back, and all my friends in the pension world, insurance worlds, look back on our work periods, life, and we think we really were lucky. We had a great profession.
Yeah, man, I love that. I can't think of a better way to close this interview. So I really thank you for your time today, and thanks so much. And I think that folks will get a lot out of this volunteer video. So take care, and I'll talk to you soon, Ron. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarah.